Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I'm going to be ranking all 31 monitors that I reviewed throughout 2021 in a tier list. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what a tier list looks like, but if you're not, here's what we're going to be doing. So on the left hand side we've got our tiers. We've got the S tier at the top, the superb tier, the excellent tier for the best monitors that I looked at in 2021, all the way down to the F tier representing the worst products. And yeah, there's a couple of those that I can already identify are going to be put into the F tier as we work our way through this. And again, a big shout out to Jared's Tech, who is the inspiration for this video. I watched his video where he went and ranked all the laptops that he reviewed throughout 2021 into a tier list, very similar to this. I thought it was an excellent video. I had a lot of fun watching it. I was very entertained by his rankings. So I'm hoping to do something very similar today with ranking all of these monitors. And it could be a relatively long video because there are quite a few monitors to get through. As this is going to be a long video, I'm not going to have too long to speak on each monitor. So if you're interested in the full reviews of every single product that we looked at in this video, I am going to link my monitor review playlist in the description below. That's going to include, basically all of the reviews. So if you're interested in going back and checking out more in-depth thoughts, that will be the best resource for that. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about value and pricing throughout this video, mostly based in the US market. And of course, pricing does fluctuate throughout the year. So I'm going to try my best to talk in a more general sense about pricing. But if you are interested in checking out the latest prices for all the products that we've talked about, again, links to those will be in the description below. Thirdly, this is not really meant to be a recommendation video. It is going to be interesting to see where the products lie. I haven't pre-planned any of this, so we're just going to be going through and ranking them as I go. But if you are interested more in my recommendations for monitors to buy at the moment, I do have a separate video on that as well. The main benefit to looking at that video, instead of looking at this tier list video, is that it's also going to include monitors from previous years, which may still be great buys in 2021. Again, this video is only going to cover the monitors that I've looked at this year. So tier list is ready to go over on a monitor over here. Let's get started with the rankings. We're going to kick this off in chronological order through the reviews throughout this year with the Alienware AW2721D. Now this is a 27-inch 1440p IPS monitor at up to 240 Hz. So it's a high-end product in the market. And I think this is a really good product. I think it's got great performance and pretty decent, at least gray calibration from the factory. It is let down a little bit by not having sRGB mode and no backlight strobing, but it's flat and I think it has decent performance. And for most of the year, I think it came in at a pretty good price. So being a high-end product with good performance, maybe A tier, but I think due to that lack of sRGB mode, I'm going to have to bump it down into the B tier to start off with, but it is still a very good product. And I think it's definitely worth its spot in the upper tier of this list. Secondly, over here, we've got the AOC 24G2. This is the new model for 2020. I guess from 2020, they kind of did sell both the new and the old model at the same time. And I believe this particular model was maybe discontinued. Anyway, it's a 24-inch 1080p 144Hz IPS monitor. And even though they changed the panel without informing anyone and sort of just kept the same model name, I think this is still a very easy to recommend IPS monitor for budget buys in the 1080p class. At least A tier based on its performance. It's fast, and I think that some of the areas where it is a regression compared to the older model in things like contrast ratio is made up for in its improvements in speed. And because to me at least this is the go-to monitor for 1080p buys at the moment, I'm going to put it in the S tier. I think this is an excellent monitor. I think most people after a 1080p product should just go straight for the 24G2 and buy that over most of the other products that I've been looking at over the past little while. Next up here, we have the BenQ XL2411K. Now this is a TN monitor. It's mostly designed for esports gaming, so it's 1080p, 24 inches, and it runs up to 144 Hz. Now, this monitor does have very good backlight strobing through BenQ's DIAC features. That is one of the reasons that you may consider buying this. If you do play a lot of games like CSGO, that sort of thing, you are going to get great backlight strobing. But at the same time, other areas are pretty terrible. It has terrible factory calibration and there's really no way to put this monitor into an accurate mode using the OSD. It's kind of got a weird like esports, bright in the shadows type mode going on, but it would have been nice to at least include that sort of feature as well. Also, it has no FreeSync. So despite being a 144 Hz monitor, no adaptive sync. So it's just fixed refresh rate, which I guess is meant for the backlight strobing mode. But to me, without FreeSync as a feature. I mean, that's a really key feature for monitors, so it's definitely going to have to go down into this lower tier somewhere. Without the backlight strobing, it would be an F tier monitor. 144 Hz with no FreeSync, yeah, pretty bad. But I think because it does have that better backlight strobing, it does deserve to go into the E tier, but certainly not a monitor that I would recommend for most people. Next up, we've got the Samsung Odyssey G5. Now, there are many versions of this monitor. I tested the 34-inch 3440 by 1440 version, so it's a VA panel running it up to 165 Hz. It is curved as well. This is pretty similar to most other ultra-wide VA displays if you're looking at this sort of class of product, so it doesn't do anything spectacular. So it's definitely not going to be going up into this high area of the charts here, and you can see those pink lines going crazy because I'm using Photoshop here. So yeah, VA monitor, it does have some dark level smearing, which immediately probably restricts it to the C tier at best, but on top of that, fairly average in terms of its color performance. It does have great contrast like you get from a lot of VA monitors, but I also feel it's a little bit pricey for what you're going to be getting. So I'd probably swing more towards buying a Gigabyte or AOC version of this monitor, which are going to give you this basically the same performance, but at a little bit of a lower price. So for me, I'm going to chuck this into the D tier. It's not the worst monitor that I reviewed this year, but it's certainly not something that I'd be rushing out to buy. Next up, we have the VX2705-2KP-MHD. So this was a 27-inch 1440p IPS monitor running at up to 144 Hz. Now, I wanted to review this because I checked out the older model, the VX2758, and I thought that was an excellent budget buy in the 1440p class when I looked at it. I think that was maybe 2019 or early 2020. Certainly, I was recommending it for quite some time. So I thought VX2705, that's going to be a great monitor. You know, it's going to improve on what the previous model provided, but it doesn't. It actually goes backwards. It is a big fail, terrible performance, big step back from the VX2758, and really there's no reason why I think this monitor is worth buying. So this is an F tier monitor, the first F tier monitor that we're looking at today. Yeah, not a good product. It is really embarrassing that they made a monitor that's newer than a previous model but made it worse somehow. I'm not quite sure how that happens. Definitely is an F tier product for me. Next up, we have the Asus ROG Swift PG279QM. So this is a 27-inch 1440p IPS monitor running at 240 Hz. To me, this monitor is definitely better than the AW2721D that we put into the B tier. So for me, this is a question of, okay, does this go in the A tier or does this go in the S tier? It really has outstanding performance, great response times and great factory calibration, so really class leading in that area from an IPS display. It's very fast, it's got a variable overdrive, it does use a G-Sync module which helps out a bit with all that sort of stuff. There are a couple of omissions. No backlight strobing is a bit weird on this sort of product. I would have liked to see that when you're getting a 240 Hz display. I think backlight strobing tends to work pretty well on those sorts of monitors. And while it did launch at $800, I believe it's slightly more expensive these days, so I guess those two things probably restrict it from being in the S tier, where you probably would be expecting, I guess, it to be the best product to recommend in that class. I think for some people you might want to opt for something a bit cheaper. So for me, I'm going to put that into the A tier, but certainly a very good monitor. And if you bought that, I think you should be very happy with what you've got. Next up, the LG 27GP850, a successor to one of their highly popular products in the 27GL850 from a couple of years ago. 27-inch 1440p IPS display here, running it up to 180 Hz. Very good performance, as always, from LG's Nano IPS panels. Slightly better than its predecessor. It's a bit better tuned. I think LG put in a bit of work there. It does also have good colors with stuff like 97% DCI P3 coverage. It's got an sRGB mode. Mediocre backlight strobing. They did include that this year with this particular monitor, but it doesn't play nicely with the LG Nano IPS panel. I think these days, if you're getting this sort of performance, it's definitely sort of B tier in terms of its performance. So it runs pretty well. Certainly I would be expecting top, you know, you're buying a high monitor, it runs well, it's got good performance. But I think these days it is just a little bit too expensive. I think they're charging $500 MSRP for this sort of product, which these days, if you're sort of buying in that mid refresh rate of a 1440p panel, is too much. So while it's not a bad product, I think it's probably going to top out in the C tier. It might even consider D tier based on the price and how expensive it is. You're really sort of pushing it there, but it is a good product. I think it's got good performance, so I'm going to end up putting it into the C tier for now. And as it turns out at the start here, we've got a monitor in every single tier to begin with, so I guess that's just a coincidence. But yeah, we'll keep on going here. We've got the Gigabyte Aorus FI27Q-X. This is another 27-inch 1440p 240Hz IPS monitor. Very decent response times, a little bit better than the AW2721D from memory, but not quite as good as the PG279QM. It also has good colors, but unfortunately it is let down by its BGR subpixel array and a few other issues with this product. I don't think it is as good as the PG279QM or the AW2721D, but also it's one of the more affordable options if you're after a 240Hz monitor, coming in quite a bit cheaper than the AW2721D there. So because it is below these two, I guess it has to go into the C tier for now. I maybe also consider D tier because of the BGR subpixel and stuff like that, but I think for now we're probably going to keep it in the C tier. Next up, we got the AOC Agon AG273QG. This is a pretty forgettable monitor. Nothing too incredible to say about this one. It does use a G-Sync module, but unfortunately it has got a few issues, stuff like only having HDMI 2.1. This is a 27-inch 1440p 165Hz monitor, so HDMI 1.4 isn't quite good enough for those sort of specs. It is also very expensive considering it uses a G-Sync module. And overall, I mean, it's a pretty average display. It's not as good as the 27GP850. And because of that, and because I think it is, probably too expensive for the price, it's going to have to go into the D tier. Certainly not a monitor that I think would be a go-to choice for many people. And there is a FreeSync alternative to this monitor, which is basically the same, has features like HDMI 2.1 and is faster. So I would just get that. The Gigabyte M32Q, this is one of the first 32-inch 1440p IPS monitors with a 170Hz refresh rate that I've looked at throughout this year. It is meant to be sort of a larger version of the M27Q that we looked at last year, and I thought was an excellent value monitor for people after a 27-inch 1440p display. But this monitor is actually better than the 27Q in a lot of ways. It doesn't have the BGR subpixel array, which is a big positive and is immediately going to chuck it up the chart a little bit here. It also is very fast. It has pretty average calibration, but it does have strobing plus VRR support simultaneously, which is a neat feature that Gigabyte has been pushing hard. And I think it's a really great value buy. I think when it launched it was slightly too expensive, but nowadays you can get it at a pretty affordable price, around that $300, $400 price point. So if you are after a larger 32-inch monitor, I think this is one of the better ones to get, and I would certainly be putting it into the A tier for now, potentially S tier, but I think A tier at the very least. We might do a few adjustments at the end just to see how things are going, but that is a very good monitor. Another monitor with pretty similar specs was the LG 32GP850, the monitor that generated a bit of controversy on Hardware Unboxed this year. So this is a larger version of the 27GP850 that you would have seen here in the C tier. So immediately this is going to be at least a C tier monitor based on its performance. It does perform very similarly in terms of response times, wide gamut support, viewing angles, has the same sort of sRGB mode and all that sort of thing. It's also, just overall in terms of its performance, it is pretty decent, but I don't think it's as good value as the M32Q that we've got up here. So to me, I would be putting this into the B tier, just a little bit below the M32Q, but I also think it's better than the 27GP850 in terms of value, and again, performance is pretty similar. So I think pricing is a little bit better on the 32-inch model, so I think it probably deserves to sit between those two products in the M32Q and the 27GP850 that we've got there. Okay, next up is the Asus ROG Swift PG32UQX, and certainly if we were ranking this monitor just on its HDR performance, it would probably be going at least into the A tier, if not the S tier, because of how good it is in its HDR. It's got 1152 backlighting zones, it can do peak brightness of like 1600 nits. It is a very impressive HDR monitor, despite being IPS. It is 32-inch as well, 144Hz, so it's great for gaming. Unfortunately though, there are a few things about it that do knock it down from sort of its A tier position that I might be giving it straight off the bat. The first one is that it does have very slow response times, much slower than you'd be wanting from a monitor that costs as much as this one does. Certainly last generation in terms of speed, which I think for me at least puts it straight into the C tier just based on its speed. I mean, you wouldn't want to spend that much money and get that sort of performance. Then on top of that, it has no HDMI 2.1, which really limits its functionality if you wanted to hook it up to, say, a game console as well as your PC for gaming using HDR at a 32-inch size. And then on top of that, it costs $3,000, which makes it pretty hard to recommend. And for that reason, despite it actually being quite a good monitor in terms of its performance in some areas, I would have to put it into the D tier, which might sound a bit harsh, but I think the combination of the response times, no HDMI 2.1, and it being very expensive means that I can't really put it above D tier. So I guess that's basically where we're at on that one. Next set of monitors, we have got the LG C1 OLED, which is kind of a TV, kind of a monitor, but I looked at it this year, and certainly if you were buying this as a TV, it would go straight into the S tier. This is one of the best TVs that you can get in my opinion, and certainly I think a lot of people would be very, very happy to have a C1 as their main TV. The 48-inch, 4K OLED running at 120Hz with obviously great HDR performance does also make it suitable for use as a monitor for content consumption, but content consumption only. And the reason I say that is it has got very deep blacks, infinite contrast ratio, which makes it great for HDR. It also has a huge screen. It's very fast in terms of its response times, near instant, and that 120Hz refresh rate also makes it more suitable for modern gaming with a PC. But the reason why I don't think I'm going to put it in the S tier just yet, at least in this initial ranking, is that it's not the best suited display to use as a monitor, with issues like its low peak brightness. It obviously has the burn-in concerns as well if you are using it for productivity apps, and it lacks things like DisplayPort, and it's just not really designed as a monitor. I feel like a smaller size with better burn-in protection, maybe a bit of higher brightness as well, would make this more suitable for use as a monitor, but it's still very good and I think worth buying for a lot of people. So for me, I'm going to be putting it into the A tier. Next up, we've got the Gigabyte Aorus FI32Q. This is basically an M32Q but expensive, which doesn't make it really worth buying in any way. I don't really know why Gigabyte released this monitor. It makes no sense. Don't buy this, just buy the M32Q. So for that, I'm going to put it into the E tier. It's not a bad product. Like, it does perform basically the same as the M32Q. So if you are buying it on a pretty steep discount, it would be just as good as the M32Q, which we ranked into the A tier. But when it's an E, when it's just offering the same thing but more expensive with a few additional features, yeah, I think I'm going to have to put it into the E tier. Next up, we've got a couple of 32-inch curved VA monitors running at 1440p 165Hz, and the first one of these is the AOC CQ32G3 bit of a mouthful of a name there. So yeah, this is your standard sort of curved VA panel. It does have dark level smearing. Its response time performance isn't great. Its color performance gets close to what you'd see in an IPS panel, but it's not as good viewing angles, that sort of thing. Obviously, it has much better contrast being a VA display, and its value proposition is okay. It is a little bit cheaper than you would see from some of these 32-inch models that we've got on the board already, like the 32GP850 or the M32Q. It is going to cost you a little bit less than that, which may make it better value if you're just after the 1440p resolution and 165Hz refresh rate. But because this monitor does have dark level smearing, and I think the performance isn't that great, I think it probably just deserves to go straight into the C tier for now. Certainly nothing amazing. I think that's where it deserves to be. Then we've got the Pixio PXC327. So this is pretty similar to the CQ32G3 but isn't as good. Pretty much that's the main result on that one, so we'll very quickly get through that one. I'm just going to put in the D tier, not as good as this monitor, and again has some of the other issues that I already talked about there. Next up, probably one of the hardest monitors to rank on this chart is the Samsung Odyssey Neo G9 for a number of reasons. Again, if I was going on the performance side of things, sort of ignoring some of the issues, it does have great contrast ratio, great response times for a VA panel. This is a 49-inch super ultra-wide display with a 5120 by 1440 resolution, runs up to 240Hz, has a 2000 zone mini LED backlight. With all of those things combined, you're getting pretty good HDR performance post the firmware update that fixed a lot of the issues, and of course very fast response times, which gives you pretty good motion clarity in a lot of situations as well. So if I was ranking it based on those features, it would probably be in the A tier in terms of its performance, at least response time and HDR performance post fix. But it is expensive, $2,500 US, which makes it almost double the price of the LG C1 OLED here. Which means that, again, for a lot of people who want a monitor for HDR gaming, you might want to swing more towards the C1 for that over the Neo G9, and neither of these are really great for productivity because they're so massive and a bit weird. So from that, you'd probably have to dock it down into the B tier because it's not as good as the C1. But then we've got the quality control issues as well, which I covered in a video extensively. So things like the scanline issues, the poor HDR performance with the firmware update that it's shipped with, and a few other issues that are continuing to be part of Samsung's monitor releases, means that, I mean, at the very best, if I was being generous, this would be a C tier monitor, but really because of those issues, I'd probably want to put it in the D tier, which feels harsh because of the performance. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to have to be a C tier monitor. I guess that's pretty much where it lies at the moment. We'll just move on for now to the Gigabyte M28U. This monitor is great. This is a 28-inch 4K IPS monitor running at 144 Hz, and I think this is the best 4K monitor that I tested this year. It's got great performance in both response times and colors, and best of all, it is excellent value. It launched at $600 US. It's available for about $650 US, but I think actually performs better than some of the $800 or even $900 monitors that we were getting last year, things like from LG and so on. So it does have some limitations. Its HDMI 2.1 performance isn't full bandwidth, which does cause a few issues with some input devices, but I think I can overlook that, and for most people this is the 4K high refresh monitor that I would recommend. So straight into the S tier in my opinion. Again, we've got a very similar monitor. Next up from Asus, we've got the VG28U L1A. So this is basically using the same panel as the Gigabyte M28U that we just looked at there. But from my perspective, it performs very similarly, and it does have full bandwidth HDMI 2.1. So from there, you'd probably think maybe this would also be an S tier product, but for the most part, it is more expensive than the M28U, and I think its performance isn't quite as good. It's not quite as well tuned as the Gigabyte product. So with it being more expensive, I still think this is a good monitor, and if you are going to buy it, you'll certainly be very happy. So I think this does deserve to be in the A tier, but it's not an S tier product. I think the Gigabyte model is better and worth buying. Next up, we've got the Gigabyte Aorus FI32U. So this is the 32-inch 4K IPS panel with 144 Hz speeds. So decent response time performance here. It does have a bit of overshoot across the refresh range, and one of the issues with this is sort of not having variable overdrive, which you might expect on a high-end product, which doesn't really create that single overdrive mode experience that I like to see. It also has a fairly average color gamut for a sort of high-performance IPS panel, and it is pretty expensive. There is an M version of this monitor, the M32U, which I didn't look at this year, which I think is worth buying over the FI32U. But for me, because it's expensive and has a few issues, this is probably a C tier monitor, if not a D tier display. But for now, I think I'll put it in the C tier. That might change a little bit later as we go through some of the other 32-inch monitors and I remind myself about their performance. Next up, we've got the Razer Raptor 27. This was, in my opinion, the worst monitor I looked at this year. So straight away we'll put that in the F tier because it is a terrible monitor that I don't think is worth buying. But I'll just explain a little bit about why I'm putting it there. So one of the main issues with this one, last generation panel. So unlike something like a 27GP850, which has very similar specs, this is a 27-inch 1440p IPS monitor running at 165 Hz. It is slower than the 27GP850 and isn't quite as good in some of its other areas as well, like its color performance. It has, it's okay in terms of colors. It doesn't have perfect calibration like was kind of advertised there, but the response time performance really is terrible, and especially for the price point, which comes in at like $800, I think, when I reviewed it, which is ludicrously expensive. Like, that's more expensive than the M28U up here at 4K 144, so we've got in the S tier. It's more expensive than the AW2721D, or very expensive, or very similar to that in terms of its price. The Alienware monitor is much better. You should just buy that over the Raptor every single day of the week. And just, the build quality, I guess, is nice. It's got a unique design, but I mean, I couldn't recommend anyone buy it. It's just terrible in terms of its response times and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely an F tier product there. Next up, we've got the Asus ROG Swift PG32UQ. So this is the non-HDR version of the PG32UQX and has very similar specs to the FI32U in terms of it being 32-inch 4K IPS 144 Hz. So it's kind of that larger format 4K display for gaming. The main issue here is that it does have slower response times than the FI32U. It has a really excellent color gamut that covers P3, Adobe RGB, and it has a decent sRGB mode as well, so you can use that in conjunction with the wide gamuts if you want. It has ELMB sync, so you get your variable refresh rates and your backlight strobing at the same time. It does have semi-HDR functionality as well, but at the end of the day, it is also quite expensive, right up there with the FI32U in terms of how pricey it is. And I just think that the performance that you're getting for that price, it doesn't quite match up for me, kind of like the Gigabyte monitor. And I probably would recommend this below the Gigabyte monitor, just based on some of the performance and pricing that we've seen since with those two products. So again, it probably could also be in the C tier, but for me, probably a D tier monitor all up. Next up, we got the MSI Optix MPG321UR+. Bit of a mouthful of a name, but at least I can read off the screen for this one. So this is a 38-inch ultra-wide display. It comes in at that 3840 by 1600 resolutions, IPS, 175Hz refresh rate. This is one of the few monitors that I think has a pretty ugly design, very large chin. Didn't really appreciate that sort of aesthetic on this particular display. I mean, I guess it has got decent speed and colors. It's got a great sRGB mode. It's a large display. Unfortunately though, it's a G-Sync Ultimate monitor, which normally would indicate that it's got good HDR performance. But this monitor, it just doesn't. It just doesn't have enough backlighting zones. I think it's got like 50 something zones, which isn't sufficient. I mean, it's not like the 1000 plus you get with the PG32QX. It's got a few gimmicks and stuff on there, and it is extremely expensive. So for me, based on those things, this really isn't a monitor that I would recommend. I mean, if it had the proper full HDR experience, then maybe I could recommend it, but it's definitely worse than the Odyssey Neo G9. I think it is worse than the PG32QX as well. So I'd almost put this in the E tier. I just think that, you know, they probably could have done a better job with this. Maybe swap out the backlight for something proper HDR and make it a bit cheaper. Very expensive. So yeah, not for me, and certainly an E tier product in the end. Then the final one from this group, we have got the Corsair Xeneon 32QHD165, the first Corsair monitor that they've come out with. And unfortunately, it's probably not going to be in these upper tiers, just based on its speed and its, well, not really its speed. It is a decently fast monitor. I mean, it uses this same sort of IPS fast technology that we've seen from a lot of the other monitors in this chart. But, you know, it lacks variable overdrive, so you're not always getting that single overdrive mode experience. It does have a very wide color gamut, which makes it great for use with Adobe RGB, P3, it's got an sRGB mode, but it has a pretty weak feature set, and it is far too expensive. It's much more expensive than you'd see from the M32Q. It's more in the line of something like the FI32Q, which I ended up putting in the E tier. You know, it's again at that sort of price. I think it was like $700 or $800. You'd probably be wanting to spend, you know, buy a high refresh rate 1440p display instead. So for me, yeah, I'd almost have to put it in the E tier. I think it's a little bit better than that. It's not just a blatant cash grab like the FI32Q, but it's also not that great. So for me, I think that probably is a D tier monitor. And look at that, we've already got 6 D tier monitors. Maybe this year wasn't that great for monitors after all. I'd like to see a few more in this S and A tier, but let's get into the final selection of monitors that I reviewed this year. 9 more monitors to go. Let's start with the MSI Optix MPG321UR-QD. So this is again a 32-inch 4K 144Hz IPS monitor, so very similar to the FI32U that we've got here, the PG32UQ. I think this monitor, again, this is a hard one to rank because it is in my opinion the best of the 4K 32-inch monitors that I've reviewed from, you know, if we're looking at sort of these couple of monitors here, and we've got the MSI model as well. I think this monitor is better than these. Because it does have, I guess the main feature of this monitor is its really great color performance. It's got a nice wide color gamut, covers Adobe RGB, P3, and it's also got great factory modes for all of those color spaces. So you've got your sRGB mode, your P3 mode, your Adobe RGB mode, and all of those work very well, which makes it a pretty suitable monitor if you wanted to use it for gaming and content creation, which I think is a really key use case for these sort of 32-inch 4K displays. But again, it's as slow as the PG32UQ. It really lacks the high performance in response times that you would expect from sort of the high-end 4K monitors. This is a $900 to $1,000 monitor, so you really would expect it to be fast. Unfortunately, it's not though. It does have a KVM switch and full HDMI 2.1, but I think it is a little bit too expensive. If it had the response times, it would certainly be an A-tier monitor, and if it was cheaper than it is, but without the response times, then maybe I would consider it in the B tier, but I think it probably just ends up as a C tier display in the end. It is certainly good, but it's, you know, I don't think it deserves these sort of upper tier spots at the moment. Next up, we've got the Gigabyte Aorus FO48U. So this is very similar to the LG C1 in terms of its performance. It uses basically the same LG OLED panel, so 4K, 48-inch, 120Hz OLED, of course. All the same sort of HDR features. It is great for content consumption, but personally I don't think that I would buy this over the C1, but I still think it is definitely an upper tier monitor. So for me, I'm just going to slot into the B tier for now. The reason why I don't think it's as good as the C1 is that the C1 tends to be a little bit cheaper. It more frequently receives discounts. Both of these monitors are roughly $1,500 MSRP, but the C1 you can often find for like $1,300, $1,200 even. The C1 also includes many more TV related features. So if you did want things like the tuner, the app functionality, the smart TV stuff, you get that with the C1. You don't get that with the Gigabyte monitor. The C1 also has slightly more advanced it's like burn-in reduction features, logo detection, that sort of stuff, and more processing features like AI upscaling. The FO48U is more of your sort of basic, just your standard monitor type setup. So for me, if they're both the same price, I'd be going with the C1. And I think if this was to get an A tier or S tier ranking, it would have to be much cheaper, like if it was below $1,000, for example. But I think B tier is where that monitor sits right now. It certainly is a very good display. I mean, those OLEDs are great, but yeah, just for me at the moment, B tier. Next up, we've got the LG 27GP83B. So this is a pretty good monitor. So let's slot it up here for the time being in the sort of A or B tier. This is very similar to the 27GP850 that we slotted into the C tier earlier. So it is a 27-inch 1440p IPS monitor running at up to 165 Hz. What it lacks from this 27GP850 model is it doesn't have backlight strobing, it lacks a few USB ports, and it caps out 165 Hz, not 180 Hz like you get with the full GP850 model, but it's a lot cheaper. You know, this monitor, the 850, is often around $500 or $450. The GP83B is often found for like $350 to $400, which makes it a much more attractive buy out of the monitors that I've reviewed this year in this sort of price tier and this sort of performance tier, 1440p, 27-inch mid refresh rate. So I really do think that with the performance that you're getting, again, very similar to that LG model down there, that this is definitely worth buying over it. So it's at least a B tier product. And I think that overall, with sort of the performance you're getting at that price, I would probably almost consider putting it up into the A tier. There's a few other products from previous years that I think are worth buying over it, so it's not quite as cheap as I'd like to see. The MSI AG273QG is one example. It's come down to sort of the price point of this display and is a bit better than it. You've got the Gigabyte M27Q as well. So for me, I would probably put that in the B tier, but it certainly is a good monitor and is worthy of a spot in the upper tier of this sort of chart, and I would be buying it over the GP850 in almost all situations. Next up, we've got the EVE Spectrum ES07D03, so the EVE Spectrum 4K, let's just call it the Spectrum 4K to make it simple. So this monitor, again, sort of your crowd-funded effort, very odd monitor with some of the issues that I talked about in the review in terms of its release strategy, which I wasn't a huge fan of. EVE Spectrum needs to put in a bit of work to make sure that people don't think this sort of thing is super dodgy. But in terms of its actual performance as a monitor, it is pretty good. It's got decent response times. It's got excellent strobing performance for this sort of display, thanks to Blurbuster's tuning on that front. It's got HDMI 2.1 full bandwidth ports there, great factory calibration. It does have bad HDR, but you kind of expect that with these sorts of higher end monitors. But again, my two sort of issues with this would be the release strategy. I think that having the pre-order system and costing exorbitant amounts for shipping, this cost me like 150 plus US to ship it down to Australia, which is way too much. The delays in getting it shipped out for pre-order backers might have made the M28U a better buy for some people in the initial parts of that sort of thing. But it is a good monitor. Like in terms of its actual performance and stuff like that, it is good. It's just too expensive, and I don't think I would recommend it over the M28U in the S tier or the VG28UQL1A, which I've got in the A tier. So for me, because it's not bad, it's not C tier or below, I think this has to go into the B tier. It would probably go into this C tier maybe if I was considering more the release strategy stuff. But I think in terms of its performance overall, this would have to be a B tier monitor in the end. So not bad. Next up, now this isn't technically a monitor, but I did review it this year sort of as a display. So I thought, I'll include the MacBook Pro 16 inches Liquid Retina XDR display in here. We'll see where it fits in amongst these monitors. It's not really the same as some of these products, so it's kind of hard to rank compared to some of these other products. But if we're talking about it as a standalone laptop display, it certainly is excellent. And if we're talking just about its color performance and its HDR performance, this would be an instant S tier product. But then it's got a notch, so then it would be an instant F tier product. Maybe that's a bit harsh. Let's put it back up into at least these upper tier products for now. So again, it's got a 10,000 zone mini LED backlight, which does deliver stunning HDR performance from an LCD based display, this being a sort of 120Hz ProMotion display with HDR functionality. Definitely on its HDR performance, it would be at least A tier, if not S tier. And then Apple includes a bunch of really excellent color profiles, which deliver proper factory calibration with the MacBook when you buy it. So that does enhance its functionality as well up into the S tier. But the thing that drops it down a few places in my mind, at least from the S tier, is firstly it has to be at no higher than A tier because of its response time performance, which is terrible. It's very, very slow. It has a lot of sort of ghosting, blurring, smearing, those sorts of issues. And with the notch, I mean, the notch, I'm not a fan of the notch, and that would perhaps put it down to B tier, but then I think B tier, that's pretty harsh for the sort of display quality that you're getting. So I think for me, this is definitely an A tier monitor sort of in the end. Certainly a very good product if you're buying a MacBook. The display is one of the key reasons to buy it, but they need to improve the response times for it to get into the S tier. For now, it is just an A tier. And again, if this was a gaming display, so if you were meant to use this primarily for playing games, then its response times would definitely be putting it down in like D or even E tier. You know, similar to sort of the PG32QX, because yeah, the response times are just terrible for gaming. But because the MacBook is more of a productivity, content creation sort of device, I think keeping it in the A tier despite its response times does make sense. Next up, we've got the Nixeus NX-EDG27X. Sort of one of the final monitors that I reviewed this year. This is honestly a pretty forgettable display. It's pretty average, sort of got it has got decent response times. It doesn't really have variable overdrive. It's got decent contrast, but poor factory calibration. It's got no sRGB mode. And at the end of the day, I think it's fairly expensive for what it's offering. It's not quite as expensive as the 27GP850, but it doesn't perform as well as that monitor, in my opinion. Whether or not this goes in the C or the D tier is up for debate, in my opinion. I think some of the monitors in the C tier are worth buying at times. You know, MPG321, 27GP850, the Neo G9. These are all monitors that you might consider buying from time to time. But at the current price for this Nixeus display, I just don't think it's a monitor that is worth buying. So until it gets cheaper, until I see it get cheaper, that would have to be a D tier product for now. And yeah, let's move on to the final display. We've got the Gigabyte Aorus FV43U, something that a lot of people wanted me to review because it's kind of that 43-inch size, so a little bit less large than the C1 and the FO48U, which makes it more usable, sort of a desktop display. 43 inches, 4K VA display at 144Hz, and there are some strengths here. It has got a very impressive contrast ratio natively, around that 4000 to 1, which is much better than most of the IPS monitors that were reviewed throughout this year. Unfortunately though, it does suffer from many of the main VA issues that we've seen in the past, like dark level smearing. It's not as bad dark level smearing as you'd see from like an Odyssey G5 or some of these other VA displays that we've got in these charts as well, like the CQ32 G3 SE. So from that perspective, you know, it's not too bad, but it is relatively slow on the response time side of things. So, you know, it's not going to be a highly ranked monitor by any means. But unfortunately, just this particular 43-inch panel that manufacturers keep using for these displays is just not very good. It's got a BGR subpixel array, which reduces text clarity, and I think that's a bit easier to see on the larger size. There's some issues with gray text in the top versus the bottom of the display that don't make a lot of sense. So for me, that's another issue that you get with this. It had poor uniformity, a lot of dark sort of gray blotchiness on the display, which is, again, sort of the issues that we've seen with these 43-inch displays in the past. And then on top of all of that, it also has poor viewing angles. So even if you're viewing it at sort of a normal viewing distance, the edges of the display can shift a little bit in terms of its gamma. So using a VA panel for this, again, I wouldn't buy it. I mean, I just wouldn't buy it. In fact, I think in the review I ended up recommending nothing over this, just waiting for like a 42-inch version of the C1 OLED. So that would be a C2 OLED, of course. So I think I basically can't recommend it. It's not a monitor that I would buy. It's not F tier bad, like it's not Raptor 27 bad. It doesn't go backwards bad, but it's not a monitor that I'd recommend for most people. So I think for me, that deserves its spot in the E tier for now. Okay, so I've got my tier list done. All 31 monitors are in from S through to F tier. Now, I guess I've just got to analyze this and see, are there any monitors that sort of stick out that I've ranked wrongly as we go and sort of put monitors in the same sort of bracket. So I think these two monitors at the top in the S tier definitely deserve to be there. Both of them I'd recommend straight away if you ask me about their individual sort of categories for monitors. Those are my go-to recommendations, so I think that definitely gets S tier ranking. The A tier as well I think is pretty fair. A lot of those monitors I'd say very similar, all are worth buying and good. Certainly have got very good performance and I'd rank very highly. And B tier as well, I feel like most of the monitors that I've put in there, you know, you sort of got monitors that are similar to monitors in the A and S tiers but aren't quite as good, like PG279QM versus AW2721D, C1 versus FO48U. I feel like all those monitors are ranked well. And then you've also got here, you know, some of the budget stuff. In the C tier, you know, I kind of sort of see some of these monitors and I think, yeah, okay, 27GP850 Neo G9, you know, these can be good. The F532U as well, you know, sort of can be good. But I think a monitor that I'd probably have to re-rank here and put a little bit lower is sort of this VA monitor that we've got here in the C tier. You know, on reflection, I really don't think I would recommend this for a lot of people. I think spending a little bit more and buying an IPS monitor or dropping down in size even, going from 32-inch to 27-inch at the same sort of price is a better way to go. So for me, I probably would have to end up dropping the CQ32 G3SE into the D tier, which means that the Pixio monitor that I reviewed that I found to be pretty similar but worse than this AOC monitor would then have to go into the E tier. So that's probably one of the re-rankings that I would consider doing, and then we can just sort of shuffle this in there to break off that gap and keep it nice. I think that's probably a better ranking of how I would see those. I think C tier monitors are still that sort of above the recommendation line of stuff that I would consider buying depending on pricing, still performs well. And then the D tier is sort of where we start seeing those monitors that aren't really worth buying in a lot of situations, that aren't as, they're equivalents to some of the monitors above here, but you know, are either too expensive, don't perform as well, or have issues. So I think most of these monitors I think are pretty fairly ranked. And there's probably some harsh calls in there. You know, people would probably appreciate the PG32UQX if you did buy it, which makes the D tier ranking maybe a bit harsh. Same with like a PG32UQ and, you know, 32QHD165. These aren't always terribly performing monitors, but they're just not, to my mind at least, the best monitors to recommend. And then I think most of these monitors in the E and F tiers definitely make sense. The E tier monitors are generally bad, except they have maybe one feature that makes it worth buying in niche situations, like, you know, backlight strobing for this monitor. This monitor is just an M32Q that's too expensive, and so on. And then the F tier monitors were the real fails of the year, and I certainly wouldn't be elevating those anywhere above F based on what I saw throughout this year. So I think this would end up being my final ranking, one re-ranking that we saw after going through them all. But I think that is a pretty fair look, which has, yeah, sort of some of them in the top tier, some of them in the bottom tier, and that I think would reflect most of the monitors that I've reviewed throughout this year. So anyway, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this one, you enjoyed a tier list video, I think this one has been going for quite some time. So yeah, appreciate everyone that's watched this one to the end. Like I said, if you want to watch the full reviews of any of the monitors that I talked about, links to that are in the description below. I'll also link Jared's Tech's laptop version of this video based on his findings on his channel. That's definitely worth watching if you're interested in laptops. Let us know if you want to do this with any sort of other things that we reviewed on the channel, CPUs and GPUs. Is that something you want to see us put into a tier list from this year? I think there'd be some very amusing F tier stuff for that sort of thing. And of course, thanks to everyone who supports us on Patreon and Floatplane. Being able to review 31 monitors in a single year is difficult. It requires a lot of time to go through and test all these things. And on top of this, I test a lot of other monitors, retesting them, updating the test methodology and all that sort of thing. So I really do appreciate people that sign up to our Patreon page to support monitor testing. It's only going to get better in 2022. So thanks for all the support, and I'll catch you in the next one.